Something interesting is happening this year during the week leading up to Easter Sunday. It offers us an interesting bit of synchronicity. The week starts today, it's Palm Sunday, and it concludes next Saturday, April 4th, which will be the 47th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. April 4th marks the end of a 64-day commemoration that we talked about at the end of February called A Season for Nonviolence. And for me, it brings a question to mind, which is, why do people who teach the principles of love and peace and nonviolence so often end up as victims of violence? It happens over and over again. Jesus, Gandhi, Dr. King, many other unfortunate examples. And one possible answer can be found in a book called The Last Week. It was written by Bible scholars Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan. It's a day-by-day account of the final week that Jesus had in Jerusalem. And what they say is that the execution of Jesus was inevitable, because that's what happens in our human forms of government when they become police states. The powerful elite use intimidation and violence to maintain their power against those who publicly and vigorously challenge them, either directly or by proxy. During the week between Palm Sunday and Good Friday, we can see what Jesus was doing. He had become one of those challengers. He was on a mission to stage acts of civil disobedience, public debates with the temple authorities, and he called them out. He exposed them as hypocrites who were way more interested in reaping profit from their collaboration with the Romans rather than doing things like spiritual leaders really should, doing things to do justice, to ease the burdens of an oppressed people. And so Dr. King, he was doing much the same thing in our time. The civil rights movement was gaining momentum. He had already called that out. And then he started to target the war in Vietnam. And like Jesus, he was executed by someone who feared the challenge that he posed to the status quo. Something that Jesus and Dr. King both had in common was that they both knew that they probably wouldn't live to see the culmination of their work. And they accepted the consequences. When Jesus went to Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, he had a pretty good idea of what was eventually going to happen. Same thing for Dr. King. In fact, the day before Dr. King was assassinated, he gave one of his famous speeches where he said this. He said, "Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." He knew something was up. He made his peace with it, and he accepted it. So here we are. It's Palm Sunday, commemorating the time when Jesus is going to Jerusalem for the very last time, not fearing anyone, and knowing that he probably would not live through the week. You know what's interesting is to take a look at the meaning of the name Jerusalem. In Hebrew, Jerusalem literally means habitation of peace. Isn't that kind of ironic? How often in the long, long history of Jerusalem has it truly been a habitation of peace? Look at it today. Jesus knew that ultimately violence awaited him in the place that was supposed to be the habitation of peace. Which explains the way that he entered the city, at least according to the story. Palm Sunday and all the events that followed the rest of the week were part of this very carefully orchestrated demonstration. In the Gospel of Mark, Palm Sunday starts with Jesus giving his followers some very detailed instructions about how to find the donkey that he's going to ride into the city. So why was it so important that he be riding this donkey? Why the elaborate instructions? Well, for that, we have to go back to the prophet Zechariah in the Hebrew Scriptures, and in particular, this passage here, which says, "Rejoice greatly, O people of Zion. Shout in triumph, O people of Jerusalem. Look, your king is coming to you. He is righteous and victorious, yet he is humble, riding on a donkey, even on a donkey's colt. I will remove the battle chariots from Israel and the war horses from Jerusalem, and I will destroy all the weapons used in battle. Your king will bring peace to the nations." So he's invoking this imagery from Zechariah. And by doing that, the author of the Gospel of Mark is saying that no weapons will be involved in the coming transformation. Jesus was going to bring peace to the nations not with weapons, but with ideas. Ideas about nonviolent resistance, a shift in consciousness instead of brute force, which was the way of the world. That was the message at the start of the last week on Palm Sunday. Imagine what that must have been like. Jesus rides into Jerusalem like a rock star. Anybody remember that rock opera, Jesus Christ Superstar? There's the song about him coming into Jerusalem where they're singing Hosanna, Hosanna, Zana, Zana, Hosanna, Hosanna, Zana, and so on and so forth. Hey JC, JC, what are you going to do for me? That was the chant of the people as he rode into town. So it's quite a greeting. And then things go downhill in a hurry. The arrest, the trial, the execution, and then bookending the week, Easter, the resurrection. So you have the last week bookended by peak experiences, Palm Sunday and Easter. But in between, there's some pretty dark stuff. The valley of the shadow of death. And the message here is that life is filled with peaks and valleys. And you can't get to the view from on high unless you're willing to go through the valley first to get there. You can't get to the resurrection unless you go through the crucifixion. And even before you get to the crucifixion, you have to go through the garden. You remember the story about the garden. The garden is the story that happens on Thursday of the last week. Jesus and his students, they'd gotten together to celebrate Passover in the traditional Jewish way with a Seder meal, which involves several ritual servings of wine. So as this kind of a thing was going on all over the city, I would imagine things got to be pretty noisy and celebratory and a bit rowdy, shall we say. And even then, though, Jesus knows he's a marked man. He's using this Seder meal as a way to say goodbye to his followers. And he's actually thinking about maybe not going through with it. He's thinking about maybe running away, finding a way out of what he knows is coming, which is why he goes up to the garden on the Mount of Olives to sit and to meditate and to try to gain some clarity, which is a good thing to do anytime that we're facing some kind of a serious question where we're feeling torn, not knowing what to do. Go to your garden, sit down, take some time in the silence. The Mount of Olives, it's really only a mountain in a very loose sense. It's about 250 feet high, Not much of a mountain when you're used to seeing the Sierra Nevada range. Looks more like a steep hill, but it's quiet. It's dark. It's far enough away from the city to get away from all the noise and the partying. It's the perfect place to go to be alone, to pray, and to meditate, to get some clarity. So Jesus is there. He's surrounded by his disciples, and they basically have the place to themselves, at least for a little while, because one of the disciples is missing. Guess who? The one called Judas Iscariot, right? The one who had agreed to lead the priests and the temple guards to arrest Jesus. Ever wonder what was up with Judas? What was it all about that he would do such a thing? Well, you know, the Gospels give us the I don't know, the somewhat facile message that Satan entered into Judas. You know, the devil made me do it, right? Bit of a cop-out, isn't it? It's a bit of a cop-out. In Unity, we don't believe in the devil. We don't believe in Satan as a power or an entity. Satan is symbolic. It represents the ego-driven side of human nature. It represents the part of us that is totally self-centered, self-involved, and driven by desire, jealousy, envy, hatred, all of those kind of things. And some scholars have suggested that Judas was a member of a group called the Zealots. They were these militant radicals who wanted to overthrow the Roman occupation by force. So maybe Judas saw this as a way to force Jesus to rise up and use his charisma to rally the people into some kind of a final revolution and drive the Romans out along with their Jewish collaborators. Whatever the explanation, I think it seems pretty clear that Judas was being driven by his own ego-driven ideas, trying to carry out his own agenda, whatever that might have been, to force the issue. And if his intention was to provoke a fight, it almost worked. As soon as the disciples saw the soldiers coming and gathering around them, and they would have had a bird's eye view of them coming from a long way away through the valley and up the Mount of Olives, as soon as they saw that happening, they asked Jesus, should we put up a fight? And without even waiting for Jesus to reply, one of them pulls out a sword and cuts off the ear of one of the high priest's servants. That's a part of the story that we can find in all four Gospels, which is somewhat unusual to find the same story in all four. But what the stories don't agree on is how Jesus responded when one of his followers cut off that person's ear. And it's the version that's in the Gospel of Luke that is totally different from the others. It's so different that it really stands out. The disciple cuts off the servant's ear, and Jesus says 4 simple words. He says, "No more of this. No more of this." What could have turned into a riot ends with 4 words. No more of this. Well, no more of what? No more violence. I think that's pretty obvious, but I think it's just a small part of what Jesus was getting at when he said no more of this. No more violence, but so much more. And some 2,000 years later, Martin Luther King said the same thing in a little different and a little more of an elaborate way. Here's what he said. "When our days become dreary with low hovering clouds of despair, and when our nights become darker than 1,000 midnights, let us remember that there is a creative force in this universe working to pull down the gigantic mountains of evil. A power that is able to make a way out of no way and transform dark yesterdays into bright tomorrows. Let us realize the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." He had a way with words, didn't he? The arc of the universe is long. It may take a while. We have to be patient. Our co-founder Charles Fillmore wrote about evil. He said this, he said, "Evil is a parasite." It's a parasite. It has no permanent life itself. Its whole existence depends on the life it borrows from its parent. All right, so we put all this together. And what it tells us is that, yes, we can fight evil. Sometimes there are measures that have to be taken, but ultimately what we call evil is self-defeating. We might give it a nudge, but its own inherent limitation is what brings about the end of evil. And we have to be careful not to feed that parasite. We have to be careful not to feed that parasite by giving it what it wants. The great philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche said this, "Beware that when fighting monsters, you yourself do not become a monster. For when you gaze long into the abyss also gazes into you." That's the message Jesus is trying to get across here. When you repay violence with violence, you're feeding the parasite. You're on your way to becoming the same kind of monster that you're trying to fight. Palm Sunday through Thursday in the garden, the message is amazingly consistent. Instead of relying on brute force, maybe it's time for a shift in consciousness. The message is to remember that in the midst of whatever kind of appearance of evil and chaos is going on in the world, there is this creative force in the universe that Martin Luther King says can pull down the mountains of evil. And we can be, like Judas, or the disciple with the sword, thinking we have to take desperate measures and always force the issue by responding to violence with violence. Or we can learn how to cooperate with that creative force that Dr. King talks about and move with the moral arc of the universe as it bends toward justice. The only way that creative force can work is through the creative power of human consciousness. The kind of human consciousness that the Christ named Jesus and Martin Luther King and so many others have demonstrated, and by demonstrating that shows us that we have that same capacity within us. The consciousness they represent believes in optimism rather than pessimism, hope rather than despair, truth instead of ignorance, joy rather than guilt and sin, tolerance in the place of fear, love instead of hatred, and compassion over selfishness. What a wonderful shift in consciousness that is. This is the level of consciousness that has accomplished the greatest good that we can see throughout human history. And so we need to keep reminding ourselves that it's up to each and every person to find that creative power, make sure that it continues to grow and to expand. Even though it takes patience, it may seem to take a long time, we dare not feed the parasite. So this is the Easter message that Unity sends out to the world as part of our vision of co-creating a world that works for all. Next week, Easter Sunday, we're going to talk about some of the ways that personal transformation can help to support this process. Resurrection as a personal experience that will help to bring that about. So, hope to see you then. Thank you.